Welcome to the debate. Today we're diving into the fascinating and frankly rapidly evolving science of chrononutrition. Basically, this is the study of how the timing of our food intake interacts with our human physiology and, our internal circadian rhythms.
Right. And it's a topic that touches on evolutionary biology, endocrinology, and honestly, just our daily modern habits.
Exactly. So the central question we are examining today is really a core disagreement in the field. Does eating late at night inherently increase visceral adiposity, what we commonly call belly fat, because of a biological misalignment with our internal clocks? Or, on the flip side, are the negative outcomes we so frequently associate with late-night eating really just driven by poor food choices, maybe too many overall calories, and individual lifestyle factors?
Yeah, and our discussion today is grounded in some really incredible recent clinical trials, metabolic imaging studies, and epidemiological data that rigorously examine the actual physiological impacts of nocturnal eating.
So just to lay our cards on the table, I will be arguing that late-night eating induces a state of circadian misalignment. I'll show how this causes specific hormonal and metabolic shifts that directly drive fat storage right into the visceral cavity, regardless of your conscious intent.
And I'll be taking the opposing position today. I am going to argue that the timing of your meals is strictly secondary to your overall energy balance, your macronutrient composition, and your individual chronotype. Treating late-night eating as this inherently obesogenic trigger is, frankly, a vast oversimplification of human metabolism. I think the data clearly shows that late eating doesn't inherently lower your overall calorie burn, and when you manage it correctly with the right nutrients, it can actually be physiologically beneficial.
Well, to really understand why late-night eating is fundamentally detrimental to metabolic health, we have to look at how the human organism evolved in the first place. I mean, we are biologically designed to bounce between two distinct states. You have your diurnal phase, the daytime, which is optimized for activity, for absorbing nutrients and burning energy.
Then you have your nocturnal phase, which is strictly dedicated to rest, cellular repair, and using up the energy you've already stored. When we consume calories during our biological night, we trigger a phenomenon known as chronodisruption. Let me break down the mechanism here because I think it's crucial to the whole debate. Imagine your brain's clock. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is the CEO of a factory. The sun goes down, so the CEO turns off the lights and sends the workers home.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Right. But we also have peripheral clocks in our metabolic organs, like the liver and the pancreas, and those clocks respond to food, not light. So when you eat a heavy meal at 10 p.m., it's like sending a massive shipment to the factory floor. The liver and pancreas are suddenly yelling, "Hey, wake up, we have work to do." Now you have the CEO trying to shut the body down for sleep, while the factory floor is forcefully pushed back onto the assembly line. That chaotic decoupling is chronodisruption. And the immediate result of that, the energy your body normally burns just by digesting food, the thermic effect of food, plummets. Studies show an 8 to 12% reduction from its daytime peak. Your body gets confused and becomes highly efficient at hoarding that unexpended energy. And because of the hormonal environment at night, it specifically packs that energy away as visceral fat, deep within your abdomen.
Look, I hear the factory analogy, and it paints a vivid picture, definitely. But treating the body like a rigid machine that just breaks down after dark completely ignores the crucial behavioral and contextual factors that actually dictate human metabolism. Our bodies are incredibly adaptable systems. Let's look at the empirical data on actual energy expenditure rather than just the theoretical biological clocks.
Okay, let's hear it.
There was some fascinating research highlighted recently by Arnold's Pump Club that looked at this exact premise. They wanted to see how meal timing affects appetite and metabolism in participants who were already dealing with obesity. The researchers split the participants into two distinct groups. Group 1 ate a morning-loaded diet, meaning they ate the vast majority of their daily calories early in the day. Group 2 ate an evening-loaded diet, consuming the bulk of their calories late. They had them follow these patterns for a full month.
Right.
The findings were definitive. The timing of the majority of their calories did not affect their overall calorie burn or their daily energy expenditure. The reason we so frequently correlate belly fat with late eating isn't because of the hands on the clock. It's because of the specific, usually terrible food choices people make at night. Let's be real. People eating late at night aren't usually steaming a bowl of broccoli. They're engaging in mindless eating, sitting on the couch with high fat, high sugar, highly processed foods. It is those excess empty calories driving the belly fat, not the time of day. In fact, if you eat specific, low energy or targeted macronutrients at night, it can be entirely neutral or even beneficial to our physiology.
I see what you're saying about overall calories, but I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are entirely dismissing the acute, objective impairments in glucose handling that happen when we eat late. It's not just about total calories, it's about what the body does with them in that specific moment.
Well,
Let's examine the rigorous clinical data from Johns Hopkins Medicine. They conducted a brilliant study where they gave participants the exact same meal. One group ate it at 6 p.m. for a normal dinner, and the other ate it at 10 p.m. for a late dinner. And to make sure they got pristine data without disturbing sleep, they utilized a non-radioactive tracer in the food and drew blood through intravenous lines throughout the night. They literally put IVs in people so they wouldn't have to wake them up.
Yeah, that was a very well-controlled study.
Extremely well controlled. And the results were striking. Just after the 10 p.m. late dinner, participants experienced an 18% higher blood sugar spike compared to the exact same meal eaten at 6 p.m. Furthermore, the fat from that late meal burned significantly slower. By the next morning, there was a 10% reduction in fat breakdown. We also know from broader physiological studies that your nighttime gastric emptying, how fast food leaves your stomach, is markedly slower. Your overall lipid oxidation declines as your body prepares for sleep. Think about it this way. The exact same plate of food eaten at 10 p.m. is biologically handled as a completely different, much more metabolically dangerous substance than if you ate it at 6 p.m. The temporal architecture of our metabolism dictates that late meals objectively impair our ability to clear glucose and mobilize fat.
I come at it from a different way. The data you're citing from Johns Hopkins is accurate, but I think we have to look at it from a slightly broader angle. Because while that 10% reduction in fat breakdown is true, it's just a snapshot, right? It's an acute measurement. A dip in overnight fat oxidation does not automatically equal long-term visceral fat accumulation, provided the overall 24-hour energy balance is maintained. Let's zoom out and look at the metabolic context provided by a robust UCLA study. They observed 16 adults and literally delayed their entire daily meal schedule by 4 hours.
Okay, but didn't that lower their metabolism?
Yes, the researchers noted that the delayed schedule temporarily lowered metabolism and altered some physiological markers in the fat tissue. However, when we look at the vast body of literature on time-restricted eating, or TRE, we see a very different real-world story. Time-restricted eating demonstrates over and over that significant weight loss and fat reduction can and does occur, regardless of whether your feeding window is early in the day or late in the evening. As long as your total caloric intake is controlled, you lose fat. If eating late inherently caused your body to pack on visceral belly fat, late window time-restricted eating would fail universally. Everyone skipping breakfast and eating from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. would be gaining belly fat, but they aren't.
That's an interesting comparison.
And furthermore, consider night eating syndrome. This is a condition where individuals consume a massive percentage of their daily calories in the middle of the night. Interestingly, this syndrome is frequently observed in people of perfectly normal weight. The very existence of non-obese people who eat half their meals at 2 a.m. suggests that compensatory behaviors like naturally eating less the next day or moving more can completely wipe out the supposed biological penalty of eating late.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because even if a person magically balances their calories perfectly over 24 hours to compensate for a midnight meal, they cannot escape the hormonal environment uniquely created by late-night eating. And that environment is entirely antagonistic to fat loss. Let's detail exactly how late meals alter your hormonal architecture, because it directly answers why the fat ends up in the belly.
I'm listening.
First, because of that impaired glucose tolerance we just talked about, from the Hopkins study, a late meal causes nocturnal hyperinsulinemia. In simple terms, your insulin levels stay way too high, way too late. High insulin directly inhibits lipolysis.
It essentially locks the doors on your fat cells, preventing your body from burning its own fat stores during the overnight fast. But there is a more insidious mechanism here, and it relates to cortisol. That same Johns Hopkins study revealed that a late dinner increased cortisol levels by 5%.
Right, the stress hormone.
Exactly. Cortisol is our primary stress hormone, and it follows a strict 24-hour rhythm. It peaks in the morning to wake us up and get us moving, and it hits a deep trough in the middle of the night so we can rest. That nighttime trough is non-negotiable for metabolic health. Here is why this matters for belly fat specifically. Visceral fat cells, the ones packed deep within your abdominal cavity around your vital organs, have a significantly higher density of glucocorticoid receptors compared to the regular subcutaneous fat just under your skin. They are highly sensitive, literally listening for cortisol signals. When you eat late and elevate your nighttime cortisol, you are disproportionately signaling those specific visceral cells to expand and mature. You are bathing highly receptive visceral fat depots in a stress hormone that actively commands them to store energy.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that the type of food ingested entirely dictates that hormonal response? You're framing this as if every single late-night meal is a massive glycemic spike in carbohydrate load that shoots insulin and cortisol through the roof. But what if someone consumes fiber-rich vegetables or legumes at night? The soluble fiber and the low glycemic index of those foods promote a steady, slow glucose absorption. You completely bypass that exaggerated post-meal glycemic spike. You prevent the hyperinsulinemia you mentioned, and you actually improve the cellular insulin response.
Well, sure, if you're eating perfectly.
But we can actually use the biological night to our advantage if we're smart about it. Let me give you the clinical trial data from Trummelin and colleagues to prove this point, because I think it turns the all late calories become fat idea on its head. They took 36 healthy young men and had them perform endurance-type exercise in the evening. Then, exactly 30 minutes before sleep at 11:30 p.m., they gave them 45 grams of either casein or whey protein. Through continuous intravenous infusions and muscle tissue sampling throughout the night, they proved that this late-night protein ingestion significantly increased muscle protein synthesis rates during their overnight recovery. The body didn't take those pre-sleep calories, panic, and lock them into visceral fat because of rogue cortisol receptors. It used them to build and repair skeletal muscle. This definitively proves that nighttime calories, when appropriately selected, aren't simply sequestered into the abdomen. They can be utilized for highly productive physiological repair.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently, because giving a pure, isolated casein protein shake to young athletes immediately following intense endurance training is a highly specific, artificial edge case. It doesn't reflect the reality of human chrononutrition for the general public. We have to look at how standard caloric intake relates to our internal biological time rather than arbitrary clock time or post-workout feeding windows.
Go on.
Consider a meticulously designed 30-day cross-sectional study that involved 110 participants. Researchers didn't just ask them what they ate. They used a time-stamped mobile phone app to record every single food intake event across a full week. Simultaneously, they measured the participants' body composition and, crucially, their dim light melatonin onset in a lab. Let's explain dim light melatonin onset, or DLMO. It's essentially your body's chemical curfew. Once your brain starts releasing melatonin, your biological night has officially started, regardless of what the clock on your wall says. Melatonin's job is to shut things down.
Right.
The results of this study were incredibly revealing. There was actually no significant difference in the actual clock hour that lean and non-lean individuals ate dinner. They all ate around the same time on the wall clock. However, when measured by their biological time, the non-lean individuals, the ones with higher body fat percentages, consumed their calories 1.1 hours closer to their melatonin onset compared to the lean group. Eating close to the release of melatonin consistently correlates with higher body fat percentages, specifically visceral fat, because melatonin actively inhibits insulin secretion. When you force your body to process a meal precisely when it is biochemically shutting down the digestive apparatus for sleep, you induce that chronodisruption we talked about earlier. That is what expands the belly fat.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why the dim light melatonin onset concept actually proves the exact opposite of your premise. It proves that individual chronotype dictates the metabolic response, which renders these broad warnings about late-night eating totally obsolete. Your argument relies on the assumption that eating late at night invariably crashes into a person's biological night, triggering this chaotic decoupling. But human chronotypes vary drastically from person to person. Let's return to that Johns Hopkins data you cited earlier, because I think you left out the most crucial secondary finding.
The segmenting by sleep rhythms?
Exactly. The researchers actually segmented those participants by their daily sleep rhythms. Among the early birds, the folks accustomed to going to sleep around 10 or 11 p.m., the late 10 p.m. meal was indeed highly disruptive, just as you said. Their blood sugar rose 30% higher, and they burned 20% less fat. It was a metabolic mess. However, look at the data for the night owls, the individuals who naturally go to bed between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. The data showed they were barely affected by the 10 p.m. meal. Their glucose and fat oxidation metrics remained perfectly stable. For a true night owl, a 10 p.m. meal isn't late in their biological day. It is perfectly aligned with their internal chronotype and their delayed melatonin onset. Therefore, a late clock time is completely irrelevant for a night owl. We cannot definitively state that eating late at night is this universal trigger for visceral adiposity when a substantial portion of the population possesses a genetic chronotype that handles evening calories with complete, total metabolic efficiency.
I'll admit, the nuance of chronotypes is absolutely vital to this field, and I welcome the complexity it brings to the discussion. It's true that a genuine night owl has a shifted schedule. However, when we synthesize all the mechanistic data, we are still left with a stark reality regarding our biology. The human body really is a masterpiece of temporal organization, forcing our peripheral metabolic clocks in the gut, the liver, and the pancreas to aggressively process food during our biological night, whether that night is defined by the setting sun for an early bird or a delayed melatonin onset for a night owl, leads to a cascade of metabolic inefficiencies. We see that significant reduction in diet-induced thermogenesis. You're just burning fewer calories to digest the food. We see nocturnal hyperinsulinemia, which shuts down fat burning, and we see those measurable spikes in cortisol. That specific hormonal storm provides the exact mechanistic environment required for visceral fat cells to mature and expand. While a perfectly controlled 45-gram portion of pure casein protein given to a trained athlete might bypass some of these pitfalls, the overarching biological rule remains solid. Eating when your body is biochemically programmed to rest disrupts your temporal architecture, and it heavily favors central fat storage.
The biology is undeniably complex, which is exactly why reducing it to a blanket rule against evening meals is insufficient. The evidence strongly suggests that the supposed dangers of night eating can be completely mitigated if you understand the levers of metabolism. Overall energy balance remains the undisputed primary driver of weight gain or weight loss. When we factor in chronotype alignment, recognizing that a true night owl eating a meal at 10 p.m. is metabolically equivalent to an early bird eating dinner at 6 p.m., the timing variable shrinks dramatically in significance. Furthermore, food quality is paramount. As we've seen, ingesting high-fiber foods that stabilize your blood glucose or pre-sleep protein that directly fuels overnight muscle synthesis proves that late-night eating is a highly individualized metric. It is actually an opportunity for targeted nutritional therapy for some people, not an absolute physiological trap that automatically expands your visceral cavity just because it's dark outside.
Despite our differing angles on the primary drivers here, there is definitely a clear point of convergence in our perspectives today. If we step out of the metabolic ward and look at the reality of modern dietary habits, late-night eating is very rarely a carefully portioned serving of legumes or casein protein. It's almost always the mindless consumption of highly processed, energy-dense, high-fat, and sugary foods eaten on the couch. I think we can absolutely agree that this behavior, combined with the metabolic vulnerabilities of the evening, undoubtedly fuels the obesity epidemic.
I fully agree with that.
The combination of late-night junk food and the resulting sleep disruption creates a terrible, vicious cycle. When your sleep is impaired by heavy, terribly composed late meals, it directly exacerbates your appetite-regulating hormones the very next day. It spikes ghrelin, the hormone that makes you ravenously hungry, and it suppresses leptin, the hormone that signals you're full. That creates a metabolic disaster for anyone, regardless of whether they're a night owl or an early bird, and regardless of their baseline metabolic rate.
Exactly. The bidirectional relationship between our biological clocks and our diets really reveals the complex beauty of chrononutrition. Our temporal internal world is just as vital to our health as the physical nutrients we put on our plates.
Indeed it is. And as science continues to unravel the intricacies of personalized nutrition and genetic chronotypes, there remains so much more to explore in the source material regarding how we can best align our habits with our individual biology.
Thank you for joining us on this intellectual journey today. We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence and draw your own conclusions.